respected scholars and younger colleagues and teachers, as well as all the participants to this distinguished gathering in the conference on the South Indian History Colloquium. I'm more than honored because of the fact that conversations like here bring about more political, social, and cultural, as well as about historical introspections. So I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity of joining you in this session. The history of subaltern political formulations in South India. Now, I should first of all like to substantiate what is the subaltern and political formulation. See, when we say that subaltern is the narrative from the below, looking at the history or looking at the narratives from below. But when we say, I like to justify, I like to qualify when we speak. And below means I don't want you to think that it is at the bottom of our consciousness. It is not the bottom of our consciousness. It is at the center of our consciousness. That's what I mean by whenever we use this reference, people, the grassroots, and the common awareness. So what happened in the history of the world before we come to this context of South India is that whether it is in the history of the world or history of South Asia or history of India, and or even to be very specific with the South Indian history, is that the common people have never been the part of the historical narrative. The common people have never been they've been more recipients. When I say the recipients in the sense they are fed into, or they have either been victims of the historical narratives, or they're fed into certain surreptitious belief about themselves, the superior consciousness, or a superior race, and or as a higher subjects. Then and also the idea of being the lower subjects in terms of people's narrative. Then in the entire history of the world, for a very, very long time, and for a very long time, even now this continues, that history has always been said from above, or has been set from above. This is one interpretation of the history from above. And another interpretation of the history is that history is predominantly or very highly with probability of being written or being given to the mass consumption by the victors. By the victors in the sense either by in a battle or in a political, massive political transformations determined by manuals of politics, or by successful battles through the maybe brutal or very establish the battlegrounds, in the history. If you talk about the Western conquest of the colonies in Asia, Africa, and as well as in Central and South America. If you take even this particular instance of history of the people, in Africa and in Asia and in South and Central America is that the Western narratives have always said that it was a white man's burden. It was a white man's burden that we are all forced to believe that white man continues to be not only superior then, even today. I can tell you that, the political interpretation, structural interpretation of politics, or even understanding of economics and the methodology of education has largely been determined by the dominant narrative. So when you come to India, India is no exception. I want to kind of say this in a very humble way. India is no exception. India is no exception. And then if you take about the Manusmriti, and there is no logic, there is no common sense that can be attributed to understanding that Manusmriti, which classifies the human society into a structural as well as a social and a cultural classification of what even people until about the nationalists during the freedom struggle continue to agree or interpret the entire history in principle of Varnashram. So I can say this, it defies any common sense. It defies any common sense, and to ask ourselves, how can we divide the society into a structure of if you say in principle, a division of labor, a caste system is a very functional analysis of a society divided into a division of labor, a functional classification, very materialist, very functional. And so if you interpret it this way, but then this should have disappeared. This functional classification, it should have disappeared over a period of time, but this did not happen. So why this did not happen is that the narrative has been provided with a social, religious, dominant discourse. The socio-religious dominant discourse of what we in the South understand as the Aryan interpretation of history. The Aryan interpretation of the cultural system. Then about in terms of how it understands. So I can give you another interesting concept is that until about the 5th century, what in Tamil literature we classically called as the Sangam period. The Sangam literature in Tamil, does not recognize until the later part, has no reference to caste system at all. The Sangam literature in ancient Tamil, the virtually right up to the 3rd or 4th AD, you can very clearly identify there are no references to caste system. There are no references to the caste as the divine formulation, or the caste obtaining, classification obtaining, what you called as the sanctity of the divine or the god and goddesses. There are no references. The literature, the ancient literature in the traditional Tamil provinces or in the South largely, even I'm taking this right of even speaking for the South in terms of the Dravidian identity. What it classifies is largely is that based on professional classification. And then this professional classification also arises from based on the nature of the land. The nature of the land is that if it is about the forest, if it is about the ocean, and if it is about the plain, and what you cannot cultivate anything, what you call pale, then about you classically define the land by its nature, by its soil, by the qualities that possesses for cultivation. So based on that, people pursued professions, it was only that classification known in the society, in ancient society. So what happens here is that then over a period of time, the dominant interpretation of history, a dominant interpretation of a culture, even redefines the God, redefines the relationship between the human society and the supreme, what you call, traditional societies all over the world. The traditional societies all over the world, be it in Asia, Africa, or Central and South America, what you call traditional societies, that they continuously, for a very long time, even today, they have a relationship with nature. They have a relationship with nature where nature is worshipped. Where nature is worshipped, and where you have a relationship of both the utilitarian relationship, or as well as whatever is utilitarian, and it also has the gratitude. You are grateful to the water, you are grateful to the land, you are grateful to the space, you are grateful to the fire, you are grateful to all the elements of the universe. And so therefore, you worship, you interact, and you cherish the relationship, and there is a tremendous societal relationship. But this particular relationship has been completely removed over a very systemic intervention of what you call the Manusmriti. The Manusmriti is a very systematically that then the resistances came, whether in the form of Buddhism, whether in the form of other earlier religions in India, but because Jainism largely subscribed to the similar concept of karma, as well as the salvation with the Hindu Dharma, as for the Manusmriti. But here in this sense here, with the Buddhism, refused to compromise. Refused to compromise, the Dravidian land, until about the 5th century and the later period, is that this particular narrative was not existent. Was non-existent, and then gradually over a period of time, the history in the sense as the medieval history and subsequently the British colonial history is that, and it became much more vocal, much more articulate from the Manusmriti's concept of view, even as a resistance, and even as organizing a society, organizing a cultural society, organizing a political society. Then Manusmriti became an instrument of power, instrument of coercion, an instrument of what you call of seeking compliance from the social structure. So now through this narrative only, the history of subaltern political formations in the South has to be seen. And I like to draw reference to after the British have consolidated their state and the colonial state and power, and then the British, one thing, if you look at the reform structure in the social reforms or in the political reforms that you find about the British political system vis-a-vis the colony like India, is that they kind of agreed in principle to the idea of social reforms, be it the sati, abolition of sati, or in principle be it addressing the issues of the social violence. But the British never really touched one factor, is that the caste system. I mean, they gave a very patient hearing, or even a passionate listening to people like Rajaram Mohan Roy and many others, but they wanted this question to be addressed within the Hindu social system, within the Hindu social structure. With the internal reforms within the system, they left it, they did not intervene with the kind of power that they had, the influence they had. So it was left more to the social reformers to challenge the dominant discourse of the cultural and political power as well as the social power that wielded by the dominant, the Brahminical or the Brahminical order. So subsequently, it was left to the dissent as well as the other articulators, what you call from the non-Brahminical side. So the non-Brahminical side, in a way, as in the Dravidian or in the southern polity, is that, and it emerged about 200 years ago, 200 and more years earlier. It emerged in the form of a rationalist form. The rationalist, in a sense, is that there is this line of the rationalist question is that they reason, they sought reasoning with issues like the divine, the divinity, and then about the Brahminical order, and also with the exposure to scientific education. And scientific education in the sense it is science and education. And it is science and education. And you have in the South and in you have in the Madras Presidency, and they continuously met. Even about 200 years ago, the Rationalist movement, the seeds of the Rational movement were kind of placed. And by the 19th century, or by the middle of 19th century, and you have people talking not only on the rationalist paradigm, but also on the question of the political power, but also on the question of political power, and which has a very long historical narrative, transcending the borders, transcending the northern and the central, western, as well as the southern India. And then in the south and in Tamil Nadu, that it arises in the form of what you call that the rationalist movement, or what you very clearly called as the Justice Party. Justice Party comes closer about the first quarter or the second half of the 20th century. It takes a very leading role, and at this time, between the last quarter of the 19th century as well as the first and the second quarter of the 20th century, the rationalist movement takes a very, very interesting and very key role in the politicization of what you call the subaltern consciousness. And you have people like Ayodhidasa, and then you subsequently come across a movement, the rationalist movement or the Justice Party, or otherwise known as Dravida Kalagam. The Justice Party played a very, very key role. And if you see Justice Party means you are reminded of people like E.V. Ramasamy, Periyar. And then before Periyar, Ayodhidasa played a very, very important role. Ayodhidasa was not known as much as Periyar. And we sometimes even think that for the kind of intellectual, political, social and a contribution that Periyar made to the awareness among the middle caste, as well as about the challenging the dominance of the Brahminical system, is that including issues like temple entry, the policies of equality and justice. And through this radicalization, this is what he also held, this radicalization. And the entire, people think that the Justice Party has only roots in Tamil Nadu. And I like to clarify, Justice Party's founders came from, not only from Tamil Nadu, but also from Kerala and from Karnataka and from Andhra Pradesh. And this is a very interesting aspect about the Justice Party. And the Justice Party has its representation not only in Tamil Nadu, but also in Kerala, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. And it was incidental that Madras Presidency, which held all this kind of diversity of the South as a kind of a fabric of the southern region. The southern fabric, and was held in the Madras Presidency. It was kind of coincident or an historical narrative. So what happens after this is that the other states, like, during the same time, like Narayana Guru in Kerala, and then in terms of historical questioning of in Karnataka, and along with the streams of the Justice Party's movements revived by the 1930s and 40s, and then in Andhra Pradesh, especially in the coastal areas, and then in the deep south, in the southern parts of Tamil Nadu as well, that Dravidian, this identity is that the subaltern consciousness was kind of awakened by the awareness of racial identity. I mean, the racial identity is that we could not have challenged. Manusmriti you challenge not because you are a Hindu, but Manusmriti you challenge because you are a Dravidian. And it doesn't subscribe to Dravidian by our ancientness. And Dravidian consciousness has never included the Brahminical order. So there is certain kind of resistance that should be placed in the history of our understanding of our consciousness. So this is how we find that the subaltern consciousness rose rapidly by the 1940s and 50s, and then for us at that time, the middle caste and as well as these marginalized communities, and came through kind of higher awareness and radicalization process, which was directed only for political power, unfortunately. And like in all political revolutions or political transformations or changes that happen in politics, usually people think that if it can happen only in terms of power, everything will fall by. Like even Gandhi used to believe, Gandhi repeatedly used to say, everything will be fine in free and independent India. Whether it is about the caste violence in villages, or the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar, or the environmental issues, or about the women justice, the violence against women, and various regional issues, was never brought into the so-called national fabric of understanding. It was only that, that's why we Indians at last, we gained very little from political independence, because it was only the transfer of power. And we could not see that independence means social reform, eradication of social violence, and overcoming communal issues, overcoming issues of poverty, and then discrimination, so the caste discrimination, so various forms of regional issues and regional violence, and the middle caste violence, and the violence, extraordinary perpetual violence of the Brahminical social order. Now, all these issues were not addressed. Now, subsequently, it is in the free and independent India, in political independence, we are given to address this issue. But how this path has happened is that, in terms of power, and we find movements in the south, there is a very great resurgence has happened among the subaltern consciousness, and also it has brought forth certain changes in the equations of power. But this has not resulted in any kind of justice. It has not resulted in justice. Why I say is that it has only changed the ruling classes. It has changed in the composition of the ruling classes. In the sense if it was the ruling class at one time was the British, then the post-British is that who you classically call as the social elites, the Brahminical elites, or the brown sahibs. Then, in the later, by the 70s, the growing awareness of the middle and the lower caste and communities coming into power, but the composition of the people who wielding power changed, but the nature of the problem persists. So that is why we continue to have the social, the caste violence, and in terms of like, the communalization of the politics and the communalization of the social spaces. And like, a classical example is that Meenakshipuram and the conversions in 1981. And the Meenakshipuram conversions in 1981 February is a classical revelation. It's a classical revelation that like, political freedom is insufficient. The political independence is insufficient. It has kind of, it's literally woke up the Indian state. What happened in Meenakshipuram? And then they were stunned to listen to the narratives of people, families, nearly 300 families which had converted themselves to Islam. And then not one person had said that like for material reason we got converted. And almost everyone had said, it is recorded, almost everyone had said we wanted to enjoy the human dignity. We wanted to enjoy the human dignity and self-respect. And like, this is a very, very important factor. This is the innate desire of human society. If you are a Muslim, if you are a Christian, if you are a Hindu, if you are a Parsi, if you are a Jew, if you belong to any religion, but you must have, you must be aware that like, I must have a freedom. There is a sense of self-dignity. There is a sense of self-honor and self-respect. So this is the key element of human societies and quest for justice. And like, in the present context is that like, even states like Andhra Pradesh, and which includes, I'm talking about Telangana as well as in Karnataka, and then like, in Kerala, and even after Narayana Gurus and many other challenging contributions made for a greater sense of equanimity and justice. And in Tamil Nadu, even after the Periyar impact, even after the radicalization of society, the caste violence persists. In that sense, like, the subaltern issues and like subaltern issues persist, which means about like, we still need to address the issues of the freedom and justice and also the human dignity. Human dignity, like, if you ask about, there are so many laws, and I will take just 2 more minutes, and there are so many laws which talks about like, banning the, what we call, working in the manual usage, manual labor in the human waste. And like, using manual labor in kind of sewages, I can tell you that like, it is still persist. It still persists, and like, you know very well, the work done by a movement or an organization in Vijayawada, which was recognized, the main reason is that this factor of human abuses still exists in the southern provinces. It's not that like, the subaltern consciousness has changed, brought about justice, brought about like equanimity, but like, but we have to kind of recognize this subaltern political formation is that what has it resulted in? It's the transforming power from the different variations of a white man to a brown sahib, from brown sahib to the upper caste, from the upper caste to the influential caste in the society, and then even if it accommodates the Bahujan, like in Uttar Pradesh, or like, the greater representation for the marginalized people in power, I want to repeat and insist a word, that participation in power does not deliver justice. Or like, being accommodated, that's called co-option. That's called co-option into power. So therefore, the subaltern, the idea of a political formation is that, but you have to address the social justice. You have to address the human dignity. You have to address what they call the self-respect. And not only by law, we know the gap between the law as well as the theory and the practice. And what law can achieve and what the society can wield, the power. So unless these gaps are addressed in terms of political formulations of a subaltern consciousness is inadequate. It has to be addressed with a much greater social reform or much greater political movement and a social movement. That's the need. That's the need that we see, that a real and a genuine transformation can take place. And I understand the limitations of time. I want about to move forward. I want to wind my address. At the same time, I like to take this opportunity to thank you for inviting me to speak on the subject.